avoid the party stand. We are very pleased to see so much interest on the subject, and we look forward to having a engaging discussion with you all. My name is Linda Gamba, and I have just recently joined the Master of Public Policy and Global Affairs program at UBC. I'm originally from Uganda, and my background is in law with a specific on energy regulation, and I'm very pleased to be part of this discussion in Canada. So before we move forward, I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered today in the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the masculine people. So I've been told that this is part of the UBC culture and commitment to recognizing the great history and the heritage that the masculine people have over this beautiful land. And I think it's a very beautiful thing that you have here. So moving forward to today's program, as you may all be aware, or some of you at least, yesterday the United Nations Climate Action Summit was held at the UN headquarters in New York. And one of the few things that came out of that discussion was a commitment by 66 countries and about 93 companies and 100 cities towards reaching a net zero emissions by 2050, which is quite a big commitment. And with this in mind and so many other commitments that governments all over the world are making, it is quite interesting that today we'll be listening to a number of distinguished panelists on the topic of climate change, especially in the lead up to the climate change strike at UBC that we're having on September 27th and the federal election that is scheduled for 21st of October. So we'll have all the panelists come at a go, and each panelist will have about 10 minutes to make their presentation, and then we'll take questions and answers at the end of that presentation. A few housekeeping rules. We have the fire emergency on the right over that door, and then the washrooms are on two floors below this on your right. So without further ado, I would like to introduce the panelists for today. The first panelist is Professor Simon Donner. Professor Donner lectures at the Department of Geography of UBC. He has done a lot of research on climate change and brings with him a host of experience to this discussion. The second panelist that we have for the day is Professor George Hoberg. Professor Hoberg lectures at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs in the disciplines of environmental and natural resources. He has written a number of books on the topic, and we are glad to listen to him today on the subject. And then the third panelist is Professor Kathryn Harrison. Dr. Harrison is a professor with the Department of Political Science and studies environmental, climate, and energy policy, as well as federalism and cooperative public policy. Dr. Harrison, you're welcome to this panel. And then last but not least, we'll have Ms. Denby McDonnell. She's a student at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, and she has a background in environmental biology, and her areas of interest are sustainable environmental and energy policy. So without further ado, I would like to invite Professor McDonnell to take over the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks for the wonderful introduction. I'm here to sort of give you the global context and sort of bring us down towards sort of Canada's challenge. And to start, we're on the West Coast here. I start with an image of a skier going off a cliff, but I also have a specific reason I show this image. When you see someone jumping off a cliff on a pair of skis, to many of us it looks dangerous, but to somebody that thinks they know what they're doing, they don't think it's very dangerous. And this is something that when I was younger, my parents and I disagreed a lot on. The challenge we face in deciding what level of climate change we're willing to withstand is similar to this question, right? It is about what level, what we consider dangerous, and the world doesn't agree on this. And that is enshrined in international policy and has an influence on Canada's decision making. So I'll show you this. So the Paris Climate Agreement, which everyone here I'm sure has heard of, is the outgrowth of 25 years of international meetings through something called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. That convention has one central goal. It's in Article 2, the ultimate objective of the convention, and any instruments it adopts, which includes the Paris Climate Agreement, including the Kyoto Protocol as well, is to achieve this, and this is the key phrase in the agreement: stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations, how many greenhouse gases we think is safe to have in the atmosphere, at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference in the climate system. Dangerous human-caused interference in the climate system. So it's saying that we don't want to cause so much climate change that it would be considered dangerous. But at the time, they did not define what dangerous meant. They offered some suggestions. But there isn't one right answer, right? Scientists around the world don't necessarily agree, but it's also not a scientific question. It's really a values question. We're not all going to have the answer to this. Just like my parents and I would disagree about whether it was a good idea for me to go off the cliff on a pair of skis. And so when the Paris Climate Agreement was actually signed, this is the reason that there are 2 temperature limits in it, right? And so the key phrase in the Paris Climate Agreement was that the goal was to hold the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, right? The 2 degrees number comes out of its origin. It's a little bit in science, but it's mostly in European policy discussions that began sort of in the 1990s. That's where the 2 degrees number comes from. Smaller developing states and other developing countries objected to the number for it not being, thinking it's not safe enough for them, but also objected to its origin, that they didn't feel like they were part of the discussion. And so lobbying went around having a smaller number, and that's where 1.5C came from, right? And so you see 2 numbers in there. Pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5C. So right in there is an agreement, is the Paris Climate Agreement is basically saying we don't all agree on what would be dangerous. Okay. And so another thing came out of the agreement that might not be as well known, that there was an invitation to ask the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to write a special report about what 1.5 degrees of warming would mean. Right? They'd never been specifically assessed. And so they said, instead of just the normal assessment cycle that we do as part of the IPCC, write a special report just on this. Right? And that happened. So I'm pointing all of this out before we get into the numbers for Canada, to be clear that these values, when you hear 2 degrees of warming is dangerous or 1.5 degrees of warming is dangerous, these are not fundamental properties of the universe. They're not fundamental properties of the Earth system. They are politically mediated decisions. There's good reason to use those as thresholds, like there's scientific arguments for it, but the decision is really a value judgment, right? And it's a value judgment everyone does not agree on. If these were fundamental properties of the climate system, they would not be round numbers, right? Think about the numbers that we know from math that are natural to the universe. They have an infinite number of digits, right? 2 degrees is unlikely to be some natural thing that just comes out of the climate system. And so from that report, that extra IPCC report, that's where this comes from. 12 years to save the Earth, right? This is the IPCC report that came out last year, that special report on 1.5C, and in it was this line, in the summary for policymakers. And this is being in the climate model pathways and everything that was run. The summation, the consensus statement was that we need to reduce emissions by 45% by 2030 to stay on a pathway that's less than 1.5 degrees warmer, right? 2030 minus 2018, you get 12 years. That's where the 12 years left to act comes from. The IPCC never said 12 years. It was just because this line was written that way. They could have said 2031, you need a 48% decrease. It would have been 13 years. So the 12 years is a bit arbitrary, but it has been motivating for people, so I think it is a valuable thing. So from this, you can take the exact same data in the IPCC report and calculate the rate of emissions decline that needs to happen for different levels of warming. And so I've done that. It's in the report. It's not that easy. It's fairly easy to extrapolate. And then we can think of what that means for Canada. Right? Canada is one of the world's larger emitters, and we're one of the larger emitters per capita, but we are still a pretty small country. Right? And so trying to figure out what slice of the pie we should get, right? And so thinking of this carbon budget left over, right? We should get some slice of it. There's no right way to do that, but the most equitable way is to say, based on our population, we should get a slice of the pie, right? We can't claim a slice of the pie based on how much we emit today, because we're really high emitters. If we claim a slice of the pie that big, it leaves nothing for the developing world, right? And so the only equitable way to do this that would actually solve the problem is to divide it more by population. So if you take that, you can create trajectories of greenhouse gas emissions for Canada that are compatible with the world reaching these different targets. So this is Canadian emissions from 1990 through to about 2018. And here's what a 4-degree pathway looks like. And just because of you can't see it because of the projector, I think, today, there's an uncertainty range around each of these lines. It's shaded, and it unfortunately doesn't seem to come out on the screen. And so that's what a 4-degree pathway would look like. Using a skiing analogy, it's like a bunny slope. It's not too hard to get there, right? When you go to a 3-degree pathway, things start to look steeper, right? When we get to 2 degrees, 2 degrees is now a double black, right? One of the more extreme runs. And then that 1.5 degree slope is something that looks like that skier just jumped off of, right? In order for Canada to do its fair share of 1.5, going towards 1.5 degrees warming or less, we need to be reducing emissions by 96 to 99% by 2030. Right? And for 2 degrees, we need to be reducing emissions by 61 to 67% by 2030. Right? So these are immense challenges. So then we can compare this to what are we actually doing? And George Hoberg is going to fill in the details of these plans, and just going to sort of introduce it a bit here. So this, right up drawn on there is Canada's target, the agreement that we would try to reduce emissions by 30% below the 2005 levels. The previous Conservative government created the target, and the current Liberal government has sort of gone along with it as well. So that's our target, and you can see that it is, if you can see the shading, it's just within the 3-degree range, basically, right? And you can see this other line without policies. That is what Canada's Environment and Climate Change Canada, in their modeling, says would happen if we didn't enact any of the policies that we proposed, basically. So we'd be well above even a 4-degree trajectory. Right? If you put in the government policies as much as we have them, so some of these are targets, right? So the Green Party and NDP have put forward targets of what they'd like to achieve. The Liberals actually, because they've been in power, have a bunch of policies that have been modeled, and so that is an estimate of what would actually be achieved. And then there's an estimate of what the Conservative Party's plan would achieve. To be clear, the Conservative Party plan does not have a target in it, so this is based on modeling. This comes from some work from Mark Jacker. And there is another analysis that finds a lower number that would be more basically halfway between the 3 and 4 degree pathways. The thing to point out about here is there's a lot of rhetoric in Canada about how we are, solidarity with the rest of the world, and we want to do what's necessary to avoid 1.5 degrees of warming, right? No party has a plan to do that. Right? They don't have a plan to do that because it's next to physically impossible at this point for Canada to play a fair share of doing it, right? Even 2 degrees is going to be an incredible challenge, right? The Green Party does have a target that's close to a 2-degree pathway, but that plan is going to see there's no modeling that shows it can necessarily achieve it quite yet. So I'll leave it at that, and let George come up and tell you about the details of the party's plan. Thank you.
Hey class. Here are the people who are in my class. Raise your hands, people in the class. Hi, great to see you. This will be on the exam. I'm very happy to be here, very happy to see so many people here. The question that I want to focus on is how do we tell whether a politician or a political party is actually serious about doing something about climate change? I mean, how do we look at what they say and their plans in order to figure out whether they're sincere about that? The reason that this is so important is because politicians spend a lot of time trying to fool us to believe that they're doing something when in fact they're not. And that is because one of the things that we've known for quite a while about policy making and the challenges of doing so is that the things that are most likely to work are often the things that are politically costly to an important constituency, and politicians want to keep that vague. So you have to be very careful to be alert for smoke and mirrors. And one of the reasons why I do what I do for a living, why we do what we do for a living, is because smoke and mirrors only works if people are actually being fooled by it. So keep that in mind as we go along. First of all, what does the climate plan have to have? It has to have a target that's meaningful and legislative. Simon gave you a really good overview about the kinds of targets. So we do have a target. that is in law. It's jurisdiction-wide. You can also create targets specific for sectors. So the question is what your target is and whether it's a reasonable one. But that's not enough. You also have to have policies that push you to meeting that target. You have to require people to do things. Either to pay money, like a carbon tax, in order to make the good more expensive so it reduces consumption of that good, or to actually regulate behavior. You could also do it through spending. Spending tends to be much less efficient and much less effective, but it can have an effect. It's just something that is it's less efficient. So it's very important when you read these sorts of plans and you listen, for example, to the Liberal Party announcement of today, that you be wary of targets or commitments without compulsory policies. And I put a couple of examples up there, trying to be nonpartisan. They come from all the parties. Even the Green Party has them, although I don't list one up here. But today's announcement from the Liberal Party is a classic example. It's a big, new, bold goal for Canada. Net zero emissions by 2050. What's the plan to get there? The only plan mentioned yet, and they may be unfolding more plans soon, was that they're going to halve the tax rates for clean tech companies. So in other words, they're going to pursue their plan by spending the least effective and the least efficient of their policies. They're not planning to, we may hear more, but they're not planning the regulations right now. Exactly the kind of policies need to be wary of. This is the existing policy landscape that we have from Canada's a very decentralized federation, as you all know, so there's a lot of policy at the provincial level, strong policies, especially in British Columbia and Quebec, but those are supplemented by federal policies. And the big federal policies, in addition to that target, are phasing out coal for electricity use by 2030, the federal backstop carbon price, which Kathryn will talk about in a lot more detail, a clean fuel standard which alters the composition of the heating and gasoline and diesel fuels that we use. So there's an increasing content of them is renewable and a decreasing content is carbon-based. And then finally, methane regulations to control inadvertent methane releases from oil and gas production. Those are the existing policies. And as Simon said, oops, I did not mean to push that. Simon went over what the, this is just a slightly different version of the same kind of projection. The number you want to look at here is that this is all those policies that are modeled, plus some credit that we get for land use. This is where the target is. Okay, this is on the baseline, that's 500 megatons. So you can see we are on a path to moving downward with these policies, but we're not on a path that we have known measures that are in place that are going to get us there. The numbers say it gets us 63% of the way there. So one of the things to check out when the Liberal government says, or the Liberal Party says, they have a plan to meet the 2030 target, this is what they're saying. They don't actually have a plan yet. This is an extremely busy slide. I don't need you to have every cell of it there done. On the top one is what all the parties say about carbon price. I'll leave it to Professor Harrison to go into more detail on that. The Liberals have a clean fuel standard, so not a pricing mechanism, but a regulatory mechanism. The Conservative Party of Canada wants to eliminate that. Neither the Green Party or the NDP say anything about it yet that I have seen. Electricity, again, I mentioned the coal phase out. That's what the Liberals focus on. Conservatives have tax incentives for, they just want to foster renewables, so a classic non-compulsory statement that doesn't actually mean anything yet. The NDP and the Greens both have some pretty bold targets. The NDP wants to be net zero by 2050, and essentially the Green Party is doubling down. You can see what all this means. That basically the hierarchy is the Liberals have a plan with compulsory policies that's getting us part of the way there. The Conservatives are going to relax things. The NDP have a somewhat stronger target, but kind of vague policies. And the Greens have a very strong target and much stronger and more specific policies. With buildings, the key objective there for some of the more progressive parties is a net zero ready or net zero building. In other words, that the amount of energy that is used by a building is also produced in that building. Okay, so that's the basic idea there. There's some other things that people do. And I mentioned the methane regulations by the Liberals. One of the big plans of the Conservative Party is to create a new brand called Clean Canada, or Canada Clean, where we basically export low-carbon products to other jurisdictions and claim credit for them through a mechanism created by the Paris Agreement that is enormously complex and not yet implemented. But that's part of what they're doing. They want us to reduce emissions elsewhere in the world and claim credit for them. The NDP relies a lot on lots and lots of spending. So they have really big subsidies, but they do plan to get to, like the Liberals do, to a 2040 zero-emission vehicle standard, but they don't have a rule on it. They just have right now it's just a goal. And again, the Green Party, give them credit for being really bold, keep it in the ground. No new fossil fuel projects, banning fracking, winding down oil sands production by 2035. So quite bold there, and I think they're highly politically tested for that reason. But those are the sorts of policies needed to meet the kind of targets that Simon was talking about. This is my last slide, just overall evaluations. The Liberals do have meaningful policy instruments, but the settings are not strong enough to meet the target. The advantage of the Liberal plan is that the settings aren't, the instruments are in place, so you just ratchet up the settings, and you could in fact get us to the target or get us beyond the target. But so far the government has not been willing to do that. The Conservative plan is a significant weakening of policies, and it will lead to emission increases, and by some estimates, actually increased costs. So that's quite surprising, but you know, a fundamental result of the two modeling exercises that have been done so far. The NDP has a stronger target and a very strong preference for spending over compulsory policies. And as a result of that, the effect of it is something we just don't know. There's no actual, not enough specifics about policies that we can measure and model to see whether they'll meet the targets. And the Greens, dramatic increases in targets and policy stringency, so much so that they finally are getting closer to where the science is. But in part because of that, the feasibility of it politically and socially for Canada is going to be a challenge. But to be honest about it, we do actually need to make really big changes in order to contribute our fair share to global greenhouse gas reductions. And so it's a plan worth considering. Thank you very much for your time.
Hello, everyone. As Professor Hoberg indicated, the centerpiece of the Liberals' policy, it's certainly not the only measure, is establishing a consistent national carbon price across the country. It's something that the Liberals ran on in 2015. It's also arguably the most controversial part of the policy. So I wanted to talk a bit about what all the fuss is about carbon taxes. And these are two images that are out there in Canadian political debate. The first is a sticker that you can order for free and from some group of citizens in Ontario. Tax carbon, get a refund, save the planet, repeat. I don't think it's quite that simple, but still. Pro-carbon tax. And this image, Justin Trudeau's carbon tax, is a cash grab, is from Conservative Party tweet, I think. So first off, what is a carbon tax? The basic idea is a carbon tax is a levy, a tax, on fossil fuels proportional to how much CO2 they release. So a fossil fuel that produces a lot of CO2 per unit of energy like coal will see a bigger price increase than one like natural gas, which is less CO2 intensive. And at the limit, renewables will not see any carbon price applied to them. And the idea of increasing the prices is that people respond to prices. A higher cost for for carbon-intensive fuels or energy sources will encourage people to conserve energy, switch to cleaner fuels. So if people are expecting the price of oil or gasoline to steadily go up, they're more likely to buy a hybrid when they replace a vehicle or even an electric vehicle. And in the case of industry as large-scale consumers of fossil fuels, it creates incentives for them to invest in new technology. Seeing that a carbon-constrained world is coming, they want to stay on top of business opportunities by innovating. An important difference between carbon taxes and other taxes, income taxes, sales taxes, is that with those other taxes, the whole point is for government to raise money to spend on things, whether it's roads or subsidies or school or health care. In the case of carbon taxes, the point is to change the price of goods. The money that comes into the government is kind of irrelevant. They could spend it on things, or they could give it all back, and the carbon tax will still work. As long as when they give that money back, it's independent of the amount each individual pays. If they give the money back the same amount per person on average, everyone still has the same incentives to conserve, switch to cleaner fuels, and innovate. Some advantages and disadvantages. I think the advantages are very important. Carbon pricing generally, and carbon taxes as one type of carbon pricing, can deliver emissions reductions at a lower cost. And that's because those who have opportunities to save more money by reducing their emissions will make deeper cuts than others. If we ask the same of everyone, it's going to cost us more to get to our target. Secondly, we already tax these goods. So it's administratively simple to add a carbon tax to the taxes that are already in place on fossil fuels, and then enhance the incentives available to either individuals or firms to reduce their carbon footprints. And finally, the stability of that price signal, the fact that the expectation is that the tax will go up year after year, creates stronger incentives for companies to invest in innovation than a regulatory approach where there's some uncertainty about how often those regulations will be updated. The disadvantages, one possible disadvantage is that carbon taxes can be regressive because low-income people spend a higher fraction of their income on energy sources. That is not necessarily the case, and I'll explain why the current carbon pricing scheme is not regressive in Canada. Also important to bear in mind that other policies can also be regressive, like regulatory approaches. It's just that the regressivity is less visible, if that is the case. The most important disadvantage is that the price is visible, and people don't like to be taxed. They like to believe that we can solve climate change by imposing costs or regulations on someone else. Do something about it, but not to me. And so these are examples of protests. On the left, we have the Gilets jaunes protests in France a year ago, in late 2018, when people became violent when there were proposed significant increases in the French carbon tax. The middle one were protests in Ontario before the Ontario election, when an emissions trading scheme was called a carbon tax, and the Conservative government under Doug Ford was elected and eliminated that. And this carbon tax is theft sign, which doesn't show up very well, is in a farmer's field near my mother's house. I'm stopped, jumped out, and took pictures of it. So what is the basic plan that's in place now? It was adopted by the current Liberal government. When in 2015 they said some provinces have already put a price on carbon, we're going to build on that. Provinces will have the first shot at establishing a carbon pricing plan, but subject to some, a federal baseline. This is what everybody has to do, and if provinces don't do it, the federal government will step in. And the basic baseline is starting at a $20 per ton carbon tax. In 2019, that increases the price of a liter of gasoline by 4 cents, increasing it steadily to $50 per ton in 2022, 11 cents per liter at that point. Uncertainty, as Professor Hoberg indicated, on what happens after that. 5 provinces did not meet the federal backstop conditions: Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, and New Brunswick. And in each of those cases, the federal government has imposed its own carbon tax. And that tax Well, first off, there's a separate plan for large industrial sources. And I'm not going to talk a lot about that, but I'd be happy to answer questions about it. It's pretty complicated. The tax on households, people buying transportation fuels and home heating fuels, they pay it up front, and then all of the money goes back to the province from which it was collected. 10% is set aside for municipalities and schools, and the other 90% takes the form of a tax credit, the same amount of money for every person in that province. And independent analysis by the Parliamentary Budget Office finds that more than 80% of households are getting more money back than they're paying. So it is not at all regressive. Comparing the parties, so the Liberal plan is a tax and dividend in the federal tax provinces, leaving it up to other provinces to do their own thing. A question of what happens after 2022. The Conservatives have said that job number one, if they are elected, will be to kill the Trudeau carbon tax. The NDP is committed to keeping the current plan. The levels that would be needed to meet the NDP's more aggressive target is unclear. Same for the Greens, the levels there would presumably be even higher given a more ambitious target. So what are some of the arguments that are being made? Because it is very controversial in many places in this country, and there is not broad public support for a federal carbon tax. The first is that it's a cash grab, and that was the picture on the right on my first slide. That's not true. The federal government, in at least federal provinces, is giving back all of the money to the provinces. In the case of industry, they're also giving back money collected to industry through sort of R&D incentives. It's possible, I suppose, that could change in the future, but I think it's less likely once people are getting dividend checks annually. If you take those dividend checks away, people are going to be mad. It won't work. What is often said is that British Columbia has had a carbon tax for 11 years now, and BC's emissions only leveled off. In fact, that's also not true. There's a growing number of peer-reviewed studies by economists that have found that BC's carbon tax did reduce emissions below what they would have been otherwise. BC's economy and population grew quite significantly during that period, so the carbon tax was doing work, but not as much work as we need. We're going to need higher carbon prices than $30 or even $50 per ton. An argument that industry is exempt while hard-working families pay the carbon tax. Again, this is not true. The industry sources that are covered by the federal carbon pricing scheme get their first 80 or 90% of emissions free, and then they pay above that. The scheme is a lot like the one designed for households that gives back money to households through a dividend while maintaining an incentive for both industry and households to reduce emissions. And what the other parties are proposing is quite similar, except that the NDP says that they would get rid of that subsidy. It is job killing. The reason for those subsidies is to protect trade-exposed industries, and that's for two reasons. One of them is that we don't want to hurt our industries relative to their competitors in other countries who may not face equally stringent standards or prices. But the other reason is, if that happens, it also doesn't help the planet because the industry pollution will just move to another country. That said, there need to be changes in where the jobs are in our economy, and one of the whole points of either regulation or carbon pricing is to cause that transition away from fossil fuels. To the extent we have a very fossil fuel intensive economy, it is true that jobs are going to move and need to move from fossil fuel intensive to less fossil fuel intensive industries. Finally, the price will increase after 2022. Nobody's saying so. I sure hope it increases after 2022 because we're not going to meet our Paris Agreement target, let alone the deeper commitments that have been proposed at $50 per ton. And I think it's kind of a sad state of Canadian politics that none of the parties, even the Greens and the NDP, are not willing to provide any estimate of what would be needed to accomplish their goal. And the other thing I think to bear in mind is the cost of the alternatives, whether it's regulation or subsidy programs, is even higher. It's just that those costs are less visible. So my final slide, I'm out of time, so I'll be very quick, is that one of the big challenges with climate change and environmental policy historically in general is that if you ask people, should governments be doing more, they say yes, they should. But if you ask them what's top of mind, it's usually something else. This election is interesting because two issues seem to be polling as top of mind: the cost of living and climate change. A couple of other issues: healthcare, taxes, economy. And one of the things that I think is a real challenge is that the kinds of things people want, if they're concerned about cost of living, is reduction in taxes, impose fewer costs on me, are very different than the things that they want for climate change. What's the alternative if we don't establish meaningful carbon prices in this country? One of them is to simply hide the costs via regulation, but those costs will be higher for Canadians. Bribe voters with their own money, a lot of that going on in this election campaign. It's costly. It's also often regressive because, you know, homeowner renovation grants go to people who own homes and have the money to renovate them. And most likely, what I fear is it will just be a continued failure by Canada to meet our emissions target, as we've done for the last 30 years. Thank you.
I wanted to start with this slide because this photo's taken in Vancouver, and as young people, we will be experiencing the most impacts of climate change, which is why it's so important for us to get out there and vote in this upcoming election. Consistently, youth voters have not had as high participation in elections. In the 2015 election, there was a big shift in youth participation, and it was around 20% of an increase in participation among youth aged 18 to 24. But still, youth participation in elections is much lower than among all eligible voters in Canada. Another huge issue with the youth participation in elections is that your participation in the first election that you're eligible for is linked to your long-term election participation throughout your lifetime. So it's really important that the first time you're eligible to vote, that you get out there and you use your ability to be engaged in the election. I'm hoping that with this 2019 election, the trend continues and that youth are engaged in voting. You might be asking, how are you able to vote? So the first thing you need to decide is choosing your home address. For most of you, that will probably be the address that you are living at while you're in school. It does not have to be your permanent address. And the second thing you need to do is register through Elections Canada using that address. Finally, you need to vote at your polling station that is assigned to you with that address that you registered for. And you need to be able to prove your identity and your home address when you go and vote. There's a few different options that you have for how you can vote at your polling station. So the first option is having one piece of ID that's government issued, and it should have your photo, your name, and your address on it. For most of us here, that's probably the least likely option if you're not living at the address that is on your driver's license or your health card. So for most of us, it's probably going to be option 2, which is two pieces of ID, one that has your name on it and one that has your current address on it. So that could look like a voter information card and a bank statement. It could be a student card and a letter of confirmation from your res or even a lease. And finally, if you do not have any ID, if you've lost your IDs, there is an option for you to have someone vote for your identity that's assigned to the same polling station as you. So there shouldn't be any reason that that you're restricted from being able to vote. There's a few examples of some of the accepted ID that you can use when you go to vote at your polling station. So that includes a band membership card, a birth certificate, a driver's license, a health card, or even a student card. And some examples of ID that you can use to prove your address would be a letter of confirmation that you can obtain from your student residence, a utilities bill, a lease or sublease, or even correspondence that's issued by UBC that has your name and your address on it. So here's a little bit of information about where and when you're able to vote. From October 5th to 9th, Elections Canada is putting advanced polls at select campuses throughout the country, and they've really amped this up this year for the 2019 election. There will most likely be a balloting process at UBC. They haven't released the exact location yet, but probably will be in the student nest. And then between October 11th and 14th, there is assigned advanced polling. So I really encourage you to vote as early as you can. And then on October 21st is when the general election is, so you can also vote at your assigned polling station on that day. There's been a lot of research in behavioral economics and psychology that tells us a bunch of ways that we can, and strategies that we can use to encourage others to vote and increase youth participation in voting in Canada. The first way is to tell other friends about friends that you know who are planning on voting. The second way is to tell your friends that they're a voter so that they improve their relation to being a voter and it becomes part of their identity. Another way is to ask your friends how and when they plan on voting to make sure that they have a plan and they actually go through with it. And finally, you can follow up with all your friends. You can text them after election day or on election day and ask them how they went out and voted to make sure that people are being accountable for voting. I would like to ask everyone in the room to just turn to the person next to them quickly for a minute and ask each other how and when you plan on voting in this election. all of you to attend the Youth Climate Strikes because there's this kind of a movement that is going to drive changes in climate policies. And beginning at 12 p.m., there will be a bike and bus convoy to Vancouver City Hall at 1 p.m. where students will meet with the general public in the climate strikes. Greta has demonstrated an immense power with her storytelling ability to create a movement and create change. And she does not even have eligibility to vote in an election. So I encourage all of you to get out there, to vote in the election, to get your friends to vote with you, and to vote with climate in mind. Thank you.
want to leave. That one? Yeah. Or this one, the strike. Let's have us imagine, visualize lots of us showing up on Friday. So we've got about half an hour for questions, comments. How many people want to ask a question or make a comment? Please raise your hands. Okay, not too many. We'll see if more come. We have a microphone here. Bearing in mind that it is election time and people have very strong feelings, so we put on a nonpartisan panel. Anyone who wants to make a statement needs to keep it short. This is not a sort of opportunity for electioneering, so make sure you have a question or a comment, and please keep it within 1 minute. And with that, over to you. Come on up to the mics. You're gonna have to come over rather than. Is there a loose one? Oh, I think that's someone else's.
So I have a question about the Green Party's platform on fossil fuel, complete disengagement with fossil fuel by 2030, I guess it's 2050 or 2030. But they have no new projects. That's the platform, right? No new fossil fuel projects.
Kathy, can you grab the mic and hand it over here?
Oh, right, for goodness.
I'm not going to answer all the questions.
Only if they're easy.
I'm just looking at that and wondering how that would ever pass. So any federal, I'm sure it'll be contested very.
Kathy and I were talking about this. The federal government has the authority to probably ban carbon emissions, right? Tax carbon emissions, ban carbon emissions. They don't have authority to ban fracking, as far as I know, or ban new fossil fuel projects per se, as long as they don't emit carbon. So, if we're going to make deep cuts in Canada, they will come with a lot of federal-provincial tensions, inevitably, unless somehow magically all of the provinces choose to get on board unanimously.
The federal government also regulates interprovincial and international pipelines and transfer of other goods. So in theory, they could ban exports. If, there will be war with Alberta. Yes, please.
Hi, I have a question for you about the way the carbon tax applies to large industrial emitters. Because you mentioned that they're covered under separate rules for emissions-intensive, trade-exposed industries. But I also saw in the CBC that the Northern BC LNG project is exempt from the carbon tax when it was approved. So they were given breaks from the sales tax and the carbon tax. So are they covered under these rules, and if so, how?
The rules for industrial emitters differ by provinces, and one of the challenges of the approach that the Liberal government took of leaving it to provinces first is we have a patchwork of inconsistent policies. So in the 5 provinces where there is a federal carbon pricing scheme, they have something called output-based pricing, where if an industry is trade exposed, they get a certain percent of their emissions free, and then they have to pay above that. Alberta also has an output-based pricing scheme of its own. Quebec has a version of that. In BC, initially all of the emissions, industry emissions and household emissions, were covered by the carbon tax. And then there was a partial exemption for LNG facilities if they met certain criteria and make world-leading standards. So there has been an exemption, and it's common and problematic when carbon taxes have been introduced in many other jurisdictions. They may start out pretty broad, and then they start giving exemptions to politically influential industries. And I do think the potential for growth of emissions within British Columbia from development of LNG has the potential to pose a huge challenge, not only for British Columbia, but for Canada, if that industry is as successful as is proposed.
Thank you for your presentations. Something I've been wondering, just following the platforms and the speeches by different political leaders in Canada, federal political leaders, is that the Conservatives often push the climate policy issue as something like a jobs against climate policy, that there's going to be a big job loss, and that's why we don't want to support any such policies. But even the parties who have a climate policy, like the rest, like Liberals, Greens, and NDP, I feel like they don't talk enough about how they're going to make that job transition for people who are going to lose out on jobs. And I think that's very, very critical, because if you want to convince the voters, especially in provinces like Alberta, that, yeah, maybe there will be some job losses, but we're going to help you transition. So I'm wondering what you think about that, and why aren't the political leaders for NDP, Greens, and the Liberals don't talk enough about the job transition and don't have a specific policy how that's going to happen?
It's a great question, and it's a very important question. If you read the Green Party plans and the NDP plans, you'll see that there's a lot of words about a just transition. It's very similar to the kind of policies that people present with respect to carbon. In a sense, the politicians want to say the right words and sound good, but they don't really have a lot of specific plans. And I actually, I'm an expert in environmental policy, not in labor policy, but I'm pretty sure that policies for a just transition are going to be much harder to design and come by, the ones that actually work and work effectively, than climate policies. Climate policies, we actually know precisely what they do. It's a very hard challenge. I should note today, to be fair to the Liberals, their announcement today does contain a couple of statements about the need for worker transition support as well. But it is something that is absolutely necessary, because while overall the climate, getting 1.5 is not going to bankrupt the economy at all, it is going to be very stressful for certain industries, and industries like the oil sands in Canada that are so geographically concentrated. It's going to have big regional impacts, and that's exactly why it's so politically difficult, but also why it's so imperative to develop effective transition plans.
I'm going to add one quick thing, and that's, I think, one of the challenges of climate change policy is we know what industry we need to get rid of. We don't know what industries are going to emerge instead. And the problem is, and I'm confident that companies will innovate, that we have a very highly educated workforce, that something else is going to emerge in its place. The problem is the people who are in the jobs that are threatened know who they are, and the people who are the potential beneficiaries of those future jobs don't know which job is theirs. But that's you guys.
I have a question for whichever of the political scientists might be interested in answering this, but if one looks at the polls at the moment, it seems within the realm of possibility that there'll be a minority government, and there's a variety of possibilities there, but for the sake of argument, let's say there's a Liberal-led minority government that is propped up by the NDP and Greens. What do you think are plausible scenarios for how that might alter the climate change policy landscape?
I think that would be really a fascinating thing to watch. I think the best example we have of that would be what's happened here in British Columbia, where after the election, the NDP and the Greens were able to get together and come up with an agreement. And that process of developing the confidence supply agreement, as it's called here, but other countries they refer to as coalitions. That would formally be a coalition, but there would be some sort of agreement to keep the government in place. The Liberals would have to get more ambitious on climate to satisfy either party. And it will also probably fundamentally alter the type of policy instruments used. I think there'll be, well, maybe not. In both cases, there's going to be a lot more spending on climate and a lot more regulation. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens.
I think it's less likely that we would see a formal supply and confidence agreement like we had in British Columbia. One of the reasons why is that if it's dependent, but if it's a Liberal minority government, sometimes they can get their legislation passed by looking to the Conservatives, and sometimes they need the NDP and smaller parties. But I agree that when it comes to climate policy, they're going to look to the NDP and Greens, and that would have the effect of strengthening climate policy. The other thing I think is intriguing is an idea that the Greens have proposed to have a multi-party committee that would make recommendations for the government as a whole. And that's, you know, she's referred to it as a wartime cabinet, I think. But it's not a crazy idea. It's something that's been done in Germany and the UK and Ireland with considerable success in depoliticizing some of these issues. Now, it's a tougher road to hoe in Canada, given the strength of the oil industry.
Not a political scientist, but one thing that when we think of a coalition government, we imagine a party that's more progressive on the issue, influencing the party that's less progressive on the issue. But I think what would be interesting in this case would be the other way around, because parties like, again, I don't say this in a partisan way, parties like the Green and NDP that do not expect to form the government can get away with making claims of what they would do in power that maybe aren't, like the bitumen promise, realistic. And so if the Greens and the NDP have to make a deal with, decide to make a deal with the Liberals, they're the ones that are going to probably be compromising even more than the Liberals would be my guess. Because their plans are not being tested by anybody. And for whatever you think about the Liberal government's plans, they have been somewhat battle tested through politics, and so we've seen what's possible. So I think it would be really interesting to see how the Greens, whether the Greens are willing to compromise, basically.
In the last campaign, there was a lot of going around about strategic voting, especially in constituencies where the NDP and the Greens were fairly strong, but there was other rural candidates as well. I'm wondering what your opinion on that is for this election.
We all say something on that one.
This is my belief, not coming from someone who's not a political scientist either, but I would say in this election it's important to always vote in what you believe in, and obviously if that's not, I think we'll have to see. It's really hard to say what's going to happen in this election, no matter what, and no matter what your riding is. So I think if you go with whatever values align with yours, I don't think you will really regret what choice you make.
You know, I gotta say that I think I agree with that completely and feel like I shouldn't have an opinion on this, in the sense that this is a deeply ethical and personal question. It's not a matter of political science or any other kind of expertise, in my opinion.
I would agree with what was just said, but I would only add that in making that ethical decision, think about what I was saying before, that parties that are not in positions to form government can say things that they would not necessarily say if they were in a different position. So I don't know how you make that calculation, but I personally take that into account.
I think strategic voting is a perfectly legitimate thing to do, and not strategically voting is a perfectly legitimate thing to do. There were quite coordinated campaigns promoting strategic voting in 2015, and one of the things I found troubling is some of the rhetoric that was blaming people who weren't strategically voting, as if it was their fault if the outcome didn't go in the way that the left might have wanted. And I think it's problematic if we do that. But I do think, we have a real challenge with an electoral system, first past the post-electoral system that tends to depress certain voices from being represented. And that includes, historically Green parties. It also arguably includes parties on the far right. I think it's unlikely that the People's Party of Canada will get 3% of the seats in Canada's parliament.
I'm really interested in that target of trying to get us down to the 1.5, and the fact that we're only 63% of the way there. And every time somebody mentions carbon tax, the general public's eyes just glaze over. They don't even make the connection, or they're tired of hearing it and don't really know what it means. What do you think the political parties' jobs are to help people understand the seriousness of this and what carbon tax, how it could work, change the landscape?
So I'm writing a book on the comparative politics of carbon taxes, and there's a lot of very discouraging stories. And one of the lessons is it's really a lot easier to politically fight a carbon tax than it is support it. So if there are opposition parties that are willing to take advantage of public misunderstanding and say things that are just not true, but are what people want to believe, that can be very successful. We saw it in Australia, we've seen it in Alberta. You know, the most encouraging example right now is what's happening in Ireland, where there was a multi-party committee in their parliament, and they agreed on a number of things. And the hardest thing to get agreement on was increasing their carbon tax significantly, but they linked arms and agreed on it. And you know it's perhaps overly optimistic, and it's certainly not something I expect to see between now and October 21st. But at what point do Canadian political parties acknowledge that this issue is just too challenging to use as an opportunity, for political opportunism?
I have another related question about carbon taxes. I do understand why some people oppose them, because if you live in a remote area with no public transit, you don't have good options for not driving. So what do you think we should do to give people other options, especially if they live in things where they don't have TransLink like we have here?
The federal carbon tax, also the BC carbon tax, I can't remember the details of other jurisdictions, provides an additional tax credit for rural voters, recognizing that some of the lower cost adaptation opportunities are not available to them. A couple of things I would say. One of them is the expectation of a carbon tax is not stop driving immediately. It's to create an incentive for everybody to drive a little less. And so there are still options, even in rural areas, for people to pool their trips, to share driving, to get a more fuel-efficient vehicle. And those are the kinds of things most people are doing in the cities, too. But I do think, intercity buses are going to be important investments in train service that help people get around by other means. People who live in rural areas often actually drive less than people in cities because they live close to their work. They're not commuting from Coquitlam into the city. So the people who have the highest commutes tend to be the suburbanites in urban areas, and they do have options to reduce their carbon footprint.
Hi, thank you all for all the information you've shared today. My question is, are any of you aware of any policy instruments related to climate and mitigating climate change that are being tried elsewhere and are not reflected in our party platforms and proposals that you wish we could see reflected here?
We have a pretty complete menu. But one of the things that's striking to me, and this is, Kathy mentioned her book, well, I'm writing a book too. So
This is further along.
But it's about the challenge actually of building a lot of renewable energy very fast. Incredibly complicated thing, logistically and politically. One of the things a lot of other jurisdictions do is just unfamiliar these days in modern neoliberal North America is local ownership and control. So having local communities actually own things allows them to literally buy into them and feel a sense of efficacy, and it might actually reduce their opposition to some of the not in my backyard effects we have. That's very common in European countries and elsewhere in a way that we don't really do anymore in Canada and the United States. But hey, the federal government bought a pipeline, so we're really kind of shifting the way we think about the relationship between the government and the market, and I think that's a very useful thing to do.
Hi everyone. I have a question kind of a little more macro in nature. I kind of get the sense that there's a tension in the kind of global political economy sphere that we haven't had a recession since 2008. There's negative yield curve, inverted yield curves going on between the US and the bond market, and lots of deficit spending, high debt to GDP ratios globally, and yet we have affordability crises in large cities across the world, and we have a climate crisis that might require lots of deficit spending. So we seem to have two opposing tensions here. I'm kind of curious to hear what might good policy look like trying to tackle these two issues.
Would you like to come up and take a shot at that?
I actually would say one thing before I turn the microphone over to my esteemed economist colleague, but we don't need to use government spending to address climate change. It's much more effective to use carbon pricing and regulations than to spend money on it. And that's something that I think we need to understand. But Sumit Gulati might have more to say about this.
Actually, that is exactly what I was going to say. If you do carbon pricing, which is what I think is the most effective way, like Kathy just told us, we don't need deficit spending to deal with climate policies. In fact, all the ones that need lots of spending are less effective. So I don't see the conflict. And in fact, I think we have a good debt to GDP ratio in a lot of these countries, and we have a lot of free money floating around, really low interest rates that have been around for so long, and they are causing some of the issues that are inequality. And I think the right way is sort of like trying to address both of them.
I'll just quickly mention as well that if you look at global emissions from fossil fuels over time, you'll see a dip every time there's a global recession, but you'll see it go back up. And in fact, to the point that you can just draw a straight line from the whole thing, that the dips that happen during a recession are always made up for emissions. Isn't it feeding back?
Last question, please, because we're getting close to the end of our time.
Hi. So discourse always tends to evolve from the initial kind of scientific problem indicators to how activist coalitions use them. And I was just wondering if any of you guys could comment on that evolution process, like if there's anything interestingly innovative, or if maybe detail and nuance is lost from that initial scientific report that may be detrimental to the cause.
That's got to be very
Science guy. So I'll comment on the first thing. So I mentioned the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's report. In terms of innovation, the IPCC is probably the biggest innovation in science government of the last century, because it's the only thing, until a similar thing was created for biodiversity, it's the only body like it where panels of scientists appointed by the United Nations review everything about the science of the subject. Like everything elevated scientific subject you study in school, nobody's ever done that. But because there was such concern about the political repercussions in the 80s, people said, well, we need to make sure this is being. So that's been really effective. I think one of the challenges, and what you've seen with the most recent report, is that the IPCC's job, and it's been clear from the beginning, is to be policy neutral, right? They can't prescribe policies, it can't be partisan, it's got to be policy neutral, and it's got to be a consensus assessment of knowledge. And so that means things that there aren't research on, right? But people fear could happen, like a war breaking out because of climate change. Well, there's no way for them to assess it, right? And so as a result, the IPCC reports are structurally end up being a bit conservative. And it's kind of hard to avoid that. And I think what's happened as a result is there's all these groups that are concerned about climate change, that the minute the IPCC report comes out, they are prepared with a way to retell it. And that is why 12 years left to act happened. IPCC report does not say that. But the day it was released, people were prepared with the message they were going to take out of it, and that's the message everyone got. So I'm not criticizing the message, but just being clear that that didn't come from the report, because it's not really the report's job to do that. I don't know if it kind of gets what you're saying.
Yeah. It's just something I've noticed with kind of.
So I thought what we could do is just each of us give any final remarks we want to say very briefly, and let's go in this direction so we can end with I gave a pretty discouraging picture. I mean, Canada's pretty modest carbon tax is threatened because of political opposition. I think that's because of voters and because politicians are afraid of voters. So I guess I would just conclude by saying the one thing that makes me feel less discouraged about the state of the world is when I'm doing some form of collective action with others, whether it's going with my family to vote or attending a big march and rally, and I will be there on Friday and hope to see you.
think everyone here would be there for as well. I just want to say that the picture I presented there looks pretty stark, right? None of the political parties in Canada are prepared to do enough to meet the sort of targets in the Paris Agreement, right? They aren't, and that's not going to change. I can't see how that's going to change because it would take an enormous change in the Canadian economy in a short period of time to the point that people would suffer as a result. So I also want to say that's not necessarily the end of the world. It's not necessarily a bad thing. The mistake, the only mistake I could say that comes out of 12 years left to act is this idea that this is a hard and fast deadline, right? The truth is the message of that report, and actually if you go to the IPCC's presentations of the report, the message was every action counts, right? And so even if we're not doing enough to get to us onto a 2-degree trajectory, it's still better. You know, doing a little is still better than doing nothing. And so I think when you're making a decision for voting or everything going towards this election, rather than despair at one party not doing enough to get us to the Paris commitment, just look for what they are doing, right, and what is possible.
The single most important thing that determines why government decision makers do what they do is how they think it's going to go over with the voters. We face a fundamental problem where politicians believe that voters want climate action, but they don't actually want to pay anything for it. You need to convince politicians that you're going to vote on climate and that you're willing to do what's necessary to achieve the targets that you think are fair and important.
So for many of us here, this might be the first time that you've been eligible to vote, and I just want to emphasize how important it is for everyone in the room to get out there and vote, get your friends to vote, and also come to the strike on Friday.